Hello again, everybody. This is Elmar Buxton, and I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Stroke Michel, who runs the Notes Reviews channel on YouTube, which covers all kinds of music across the progressive rock, progressive metal, and death metal genres, principally. But then there's some other stuff in there as well. A huge range of things like interviews, worst to best albums, and other stuff that would be very interesting. I've looked at it, a lot of it myself, and I think that there is some fantastic material there. The bands that Michael's covered include Opeth, King Crimson, Yes, Porcupine Tree, Stephen Wilson, Supertramp, Genesis, Dream Theater, Big Big Train, Pink Floyd, and Roger Waters. And it's the last of those that we'll be discussing today. Mr. Waters and his former bandmates in Pink Floyd, who don't need any introduction. And the principal question I'm going to be asking is Roger Waters a hero or a villain? Because he, in a fairly gentlemanly genre of music, he's definitely one of the more controversial characters, seen in all kinds of different ways, quite strongly by different people who love their music. So thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here.
My first question, Roger Waters is considered, particularly by his fans, to be the brains behind albums such as The Orwellian Animals, The Anti-War, The Final Cut, and perhaps most famously, the tortured psychodrama of The War. Why do you think he's seen as divisive by quite a lot of people?
Oh, that's a loaded question, I think. I mean, definitely within his writing style, it's very sharp and very poignant. There's in certain degree, there's a little bit of subtlety, but honestly, there's not a whole lot. And so when you cut with that type of a knife, it's going to be controversial and it's going to be divisive. That's the point. You want to cut to the chase. So because I feel he doesn't really deal with subtlety, he doesn't really deal with metaphors and allegories and all that. He basically just comes right out and says it. That's quite divisive because there's not a whole lot of wiggle room for interpretation in that kind of sense. And when you're dealing with, especially art, and you only really have one interpretation, it's going to be divisive in that sense. And that's just speaking musically. And also his music is quite dark. It's always quite brooding, quite moody, which is very, different and very counter to, I think, a lot of the other band members whose music is perhaps a little bit more atmospheric, a little bit more uplifting, and a little bit more jovial and maybe a little bit more optimistic. So, there's a little bit of a contention in what is the Pink Floyd sound, right? Is the Pink Floyd sound that very psychedelic, trippy, experimental stuff that we got from their earlier albums? Is it very atmospheric, very jovial, very happy that we got with their last couple of records that was more fronted by David Gilmour? Or is it this very introspective, very moody, very brooding kind of an aspect? So I think musically and artistically, that's part of the reason why he can be very divisive. And he's also not shy of saying his opinions. And he's always been that way, especially politically. And a lot of people find that also very divisive and a little bit of a jagged pill. And he's never been shy of, opening and closing concerts like that. So yeah, I feel like kind of in a roundabout way, that's, I think, why a lot of Pink Floyd fans find him divisive. You either kind of love him, hate him, or I guess in my case, a little bit ambivalent and not all that interested. I always find it very interesting to see, what is he doing with this? What is he actually saying? I always find that a little bit more interesting.
Because progressive rock in particular is seen as quite fantastical. There could be stuff about sort of, you can have series of concept records about literally a spaceship going through space and stuff like that. Or it could be about sort of almost a Dungeons and Dragons-y sort of Middle Earth type world. It could be, they throw everything in there that's very fantastical or scientific. But the interesting thing with Floyd, as you say, is it changed so much because his views, which were they were bubbling away under the surface in some of their early stuff like Corporal Clegg and things from the second record, suddenly became very, as you say, it didn't muck about. It's unusually direct. So I think that probably is a factor, isn't it? One other thing I was going to ask, actually,
Yeah,
he's spoken recently of his struggles with depression, which are probably
sure.
would have been analysed and dealt with differently now than back in, say, the 1970s.
Sure.
How do you think this affected his work? And do you think that this is sometimes overlooked by the people who are most critical of him?
That's interesting. I mean, definitely back in the 70s, like I have a background in psychology and the history and evolution of like actual psychological treatments and whatnot. So, back in the 70s and 60s and whatnot, there really wasn't any kind of treatment outside of like psychoanalyticism. And it definitely was not talked about, especially like as it is today. So for many artists, their only way of dealing and their only way of kind of getting out of, not even getting out of it, but dealing with it is through their art form. And you definitely see that within Roger's writing style and within his music. And as I mentioned, it's very brooding. It's very melodramatic, but not in like a show tuney fashion way, but much more in a expressive kind of a way. So I think in that sense, like this was him trying to make sense of it, because we didn't talk about it, so there wasn't any kind of benchmarking. There was no way of seeing, am I the only one with this kind of thing? Like that whole, is there anybody out there? Is there anybody else that's experiencing these things to the same extent that I am? And I, in terms of being critical about the music, I think there's the intent, and then there's the final product, right? And people can interpret the art however they want to, and that's one of the greatest things about art itself. And I think there's the contextualizing of the product that we got, right? So I think it adds to the conversation of whatever piece we're talking about within Roger's work. But I don't think it underscores or it diminishes any of the critiques that came about when that person sat down and listened to it, right? Like they only have whatever they have at that, because we can't live in Roger Waters' shoes and we can't actually be Roger Waters, like a being John Malkovich in that kind of sense. We'll never 100% know whatever the intent was. We'll never 100% know what it was that he was trying to get across. Even if he sits down and tells us, there might be small nuances. There might be little things that even he wouldn't know. So I think it just adds for a greater breadth of context when we're dealing with Roger Waters' work.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's sort of you probably wonder how you would have dealt with him at the time if you'd been around, because you could probably have brought a different perspective for him. But it's in a different incarnation. You did touch on this, but do you think that his views on the Israel-Palestine conflict can be disregarded for people to enjoy his music, or do you think his image is too embedded with that?
No, I mean, there's that whole concept of death of the author, right? And I feel with Roger Waters, you can do that with a lot of his earlier work. His work with Animals, The Wall, most of his work with Pink Floyd, maybe not so much with The Final Cut. And within certain respects, I think some of his solo stuff, you can do that as well. I think he is bringing a lot of his work from the past into a concept and context of today's light within his stance within Palestine. And I think writing music going forward, it will be much more difficult, just because he is so passionate about that, because he is so it's so entrenched in almost everything that he does at this point, is that free Palestine. It's the atrocities of the war. And I always felt as if Roger Waters was when he's coming about within his, he's never actually done like a protest track. Like he's done thought pieces. He's done the musical equivalent of a think piece or a letter to the editor. But I don't think he's ever actually done like a full-fledged protest song in the ways that like the 60s and 70s were doing, with like that type of stuff. Like he's done tracks here and there. But I'm getting away from the narrative in terms of my own head here. So I think bringing it back to the original question, I think moving forward, it will be interesting to see how he reevaluates his own work, because he's been doing that with Dark Side of the Moon. He's been doing that in pretty much all of his concerts, like his last one of Us and Them, was very poignant of, you know, the conflicts. And I think within his own writing style and within his own activism, he's been much more of a, and that was the point I was going to make, more of a pacifistic antagonist when it comes to the current systems that are in place. And I think that's kind of his big stance of things. And that's like, pacifism is definitely more of his MO and more of his like core belief system. But he also wants to be an antagonist to the system that is ruining people's lives and literally slaughtering millions of people. So yeah, I think that's kind of where we are currently. And I think you can definitely divorce Roger Waters, the man, and the ideologies that he holds currently within some of his earlier works. But I think that's also getting harder and harder to do now. So yeah.
I was going to ask what you thought of the his Redux version of Dark Side of the Moon, because I listened to it twice, and I had quite different reactions each time. I don't know if you did. Did you sort of listen and think?
I did. Yeah. Literally the first time I listened to it, I fell asleep. You know, so I get the intent and I get the reason why he's doing this. I'm glad that he's finding some kind of catharsis about it. I'm glad that he's finding it like an artistic exercise. But for me, I don't think I'll ever sit down and listen to it again, because I've listened to it, you know, a half dozen times, and there's nothing in it that I would want to return to, or there's nothing for me that is added to it that I would enjoy more than just listening to the original Dark Side of the Moon. Like, it's not, you know, the closest comparison I can think of is like a Taylor Swift's version of some of her other albums, and the reason why she's kind of redoing her albums. I don't feel that same kind of draw for this. It's artistically very interesting, and I applaud him for trying something like this, but musically, I don't think I would sit down and listen to it again.
It always felt to me like a sort of like a diary entry set to the remembrance of the music, and to sort of highlight the sort of, you know, a lot of people were saying it was very profound because of the change in the, you know, the time, isn't it? Sort of 50 years later or whatever it was. But yeah, I did find it. Yeah, the people that liked it thought it was brilliant, but there was a lot of people that probably felt the same way you and I did. The next question I was going to ask is something I've always noticed about Pink Floyd as a band. For those who don't know as huge amount about Pink Floyd, other than the sort of Dark Side of the Moon and the Wall, it was basically split into 3 eras. So you had Syd Barrett at the beginning when it was psychedelic, and he was the band leader. Roger Waters was in the band, but he wasn't writing a great amount, and he was still learning his craft, perhaps. Gilmour wasn't in the band. Syd Barrett had his, unfortunately, you know, potentially drug-induced mental breakdown and left the business and became a recluse. Waters then increasingly became, over time, slowly became more and more dominant within the band, but that's the classic era. You got Dark Side of the Moon and then The Wall later on. Then there were problems. You know, obviously the band were massive, but Roger went his separate ways, and then it was David Gilmour did a couple of records and a live record, and without Roger. One thing I've noticed, sorry if that's a slightly long-winded way of getting to the question, but just for people who you know don't know as much as perhaps I'd like to yet about the band. I've noticed that each of the figureheads of the different eras of the band have their devotees, and they tend to see that as being the real Pink Floyd. So Syd Barrett, you know, that was the band, and it ended when Syd left, or you know, was forced out, or whatever happened to him. Some that worship everything Roger does and says, and then there's the people who just say, well, Gilmour, obviously very influential guitarist, and they love his singing voice, and they love his, you know, his materials. You say it's definitely got a very different tenor to it. But why do you think that the band has that kind of? I mean, I'm not like that, but why do you think there is quite a lot of Pink Floyd fans who say, right, I only like this era, you know, Barrett, Waters, Gilmour? Why do you think it's that kind of band where there's that sort of split between the fans and the different eras?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think you're going to find that with almost any band that has that type of evolution throughout their career. There will be those who only like the early stuff, or you only like that particular style of it. And I think that's true for like any kind of artistic movement that has longevity and has like different eras, you know. I think it's very unique for Pink Floyd because it really depends on who has their hand on the steering wheel at that time. And I mean, my favorite iteration of the band was when all of the band members were kind of coming together and they all had maybe not necessarily an equal hand on the steering wheel, but at least had some sway on it. Like my favorite album from them is Atom Heart Mother. And that was one where like everybody was playing pretty equally. Same with Obscured by Clouds and Metal. It wasn't until I think Roger got really much more confident in his writing style and within his concepts within albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals in the Wall. But it's still when everybody is playing with, some kind of intent and everybody's on the same page and they all want the same amount of whatever creative style is found on the page there. I don't necessarily like when one artist or one personality takes complete control, which is why I'm not a big fan of albums like The Wall or The Final Cut, which are basically just Roger Waters solo stuff with the rest of the band kind of playing backup. And it's part of the reason why I enjoy, say, A Momentary Lapse of Reason and Division Bell a little bit more, because at least Richard Wright and Nick Mason are much more, incorporated on those records than they ever were on, and because that way you're getting the strengths of each of the members. You're getting wherever the kind of weakness or where some of those artists struggle, you have some of the other band members to come help fill out wherever they are. And that's part of one of the biggest issues that I have with like The Final Cut and The Wall is like, you can definitely see where Roger Waters has weaknesses within his musical and compositions and orchestrations of sound where, not Nick Mason, Nick Mason's the drummer, Richard Wright, where he would come in and help with the atmosphere, help with the orchestration and the compositions. I know I'm getting really far away from the question, so I'll bring it back to the question. I think for, Pink Floyd, because each iteration is so different, those first two records where you had a much more of a prevalent Syd Barrett has a very unique sound, much more psychedelic that wouldn't necessarily be found in later albums. So those that like that psychedelic sound, they're going to gravitate to that. Those who love more of the Roger Waters introspective, very, intellectual, I'll say, with like albums like From Dark Side of the Moon all the way to The Final Cut. I think they'll gravitate more to that. But, the fun, quirky, weird stuff that was the psychedelia, they probably won't get. And then the more, impressionistic, the more Gilmour-esque stuff of their last two records, they might not necessarily appeal. And, the same's kind of for all of those. So, much like we were talking about before you hit the record button, like with King Crimson, you're dealing with three different bands rather than one band that's just kind of changing their sound every once in a while.
Yes, it's interesting you mentioned Atom Heart Mother because I saw you got I saw something on your site about that record, and it was 1970, I think, and
yeah,
it's when I listened to that album, I think it was their first number one, and Roger in particular, they all slate it. They say it was a disaster, it was a mess and everything. And I know they had some problems with the orchestra, but it's a shame because when you listen to the tone of it, particularly something like Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, which I always had a bit of a soft spot for that track.
I love that track.
It's got a warm, summery, sort of happy vibe to it, which if you listen to The Wall at the end of the decade, you can't believe it's the same band at all, because that certainly hasn't got that at all, has it?
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's odd, isn't it? I think Nick Mason touched on that. He said it's almost that their emotions are tied to the situation that the band was in when they made the record, rather than is the record any good. So it's almost like they're judging their lives at that period of time.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's why Roger sometimes comes down quite hard on his own material, particularly from the early days. But it doesn't mean it's bad, does it? I mean, people go, "Oh, if he didn't like it, it must be bad." Well, no, it's as you say, he's got his own view of the world.
Yeah, and I never liked the criticism. Yeah, and I never liked the criticism of, oh, the band or the artist didn't like their work, then that makes it bad. I mean, if that were the case, then Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite would be one of the worst things that have ever been made, and yet we listen to it every Christmas, we listen to it all the time, and yet he despised that piece.
Yeah.
So I never really subscribed to, oh, the artists themselves didn't like it, therefore it bad. I'm like, no, it's just for whatever reason it didn't come out the way that they planned it to, right? So.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I like that. Very good. These days, you can hear David Gilmour's influence in bands like RPWL, Mostly Autumn, Fish on Friday, Brilliant, Arena, and It Bites. Which bands or artists would you say carry Roger's torch? If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, because David Gilmour definitely has more of like a neo-prog flavor to his style. You know, as you mentioned, the Marillions, the Arenas, the It Bites. I mean, practically anything that John Mitchell touches has that kind of signature sound. I think with Roger Waters, you can feel his influence on, like, obviously Steven Wilson, will credit him as being, you know, a big influence for him. But I think on bands that are a little bit more introspective and kind of try to get more at the root of like the human experience, and especially within the prog scene, you know, we would see that with bands like Athema, we would see that with bands like Gazpacho, you know, more of those like kind of modern progressive bands rather than the neo progressive bands. That really go in for songwriting, ship, and atmosphere, rather than like the big guitar solos. So those are the two that immediately come to my mind, especially just more within the vibe. Like listening to Gazpacho's Demon or Firebringer or even like the Firebird, you can definitely see the influence that Roger Waters would have had with that kind of an album.
Good. Yes, yeah, because I've heard stuff that tries to be like him, but I think they're more kind of almost people that sort of start off sort of being a copycat, then do their own thing. But though, yeah, it's interesting. I have come across one or two bands that have really reminded me of him. Particularly, there's a band, Servants of Science, did an album, a little sort of independent progressive band, and I saw them live actually, and they were did the whole thing through. So they were, yeah, they definitely, the singer definitely reminded me of him. And my final question would be, and I think this is something that's probably everybody probably thinks about with Floyd. If Roger hadn't left and fallen out, however we want to put it, in the 80s, what would have happened with Floyd, and what would their impact be on music subsequently if they'd stayed together?
I mean, that's a hard question because like Richard Wright was already out of the band by that point, and the only reason why he came back was because Roger wasn't there. So you're kind of losing a major sound within what made Pink Floyd so special to me. And I think so special to so many different people. And if they had kept going, I think there would have continued to be a lot of animosity. There would have been a lot of contention. And I think eventually we would have gotten albums like Amused to Death and The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, but much more, I don't know, maybe watered down in that sense. Like I still think that like the best case scenario, I would have had like Pink Floyd almost disband prior to the final cut and have the final cut just be a Roger Waters album, because it comes with so much baggage being a Pink Floyd record rather than it just being the successor of The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. So I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think we would have gotten a lot more moody music, especially like from Amused to Death. Like I'm thinking about those records that Roger would then go on to do. And I think it would have tied like David Gilmour to not allow him to do some of his solo stuff, because his first two records, the self-titled and About Face, I think were really good in showcasing where we would then go for like A Momentary Lapse of Reason, because there's so much DNA in those two records in Momentary Lapse of Reason. And sadly, we wouldn't get the masterpiece that is the Division Bell. Like the Division Bell, I still think is one of Pink Floyd's best works.
Yes, I've always liked it.
You know, and I would almost like looking at the two realities of having Roger Waters stay in the band, where the Division Bell doesn't exist, and the reality where he left the band and, you know, tried to dissolve the band, and have the universe where the Division Bell exists. I'd rather pick that one, and I'd pick that one every single time, because I can't think of any other thing that Roger would bring to the table that Pink Floyd could do where what he wanted out of the band was so different than what Nick Mason and David Gilmour wanted out of the band. And I think at the end of the day, that's why it fell apart. So yeah, I know that's not necessarily probably the answer that you were looking for, but I think that's kind of like where it would have been if Roger had stayed with the band and they had soldiered on, so to speak, within the 80s and the 90s.
I also think it's a bit of an irony. Well, certainly recently I've thought about it, that from what I understand from Nick Mason's book, and I think I've read it elsewhere as well, Roger presented, by that point, he was pretty much coming in saying, here's the work I want you to do, and then you sort of help me do it.
Yeah.
And they were presented The Wall and the Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which was, as you and I obviously know, it's his first solo album, his first full solo album, if you don't include that one about the body. But I wonder how Rick Wright felt about. I think they all decided that the Hitchhiker record was too personal, but then Wright was often got fed up with Roger's going on about the war again and stuff like that. But then, if they'd chosen the Hitchhiking record as the demos they wanted to work on instead of The Wall, then everything would have been probably totally different. I mean, obviously,
it would have. I think it would have been different because I think the objective would have been much more clear. Because I think with both The Wall and Pros and Cons, like they're both extremely personal albums for Roger Waters, and they're both autobiographical, right? Whereas like The Wall, at least you could say distance it at arm's length and being, well, it's not really about me, it's about this character of Pink and how he's dealing with isolation and how he's dealing with, you know, the traumas of his childhood and his past and building up the isolation to help protect himself and the fallout of that as a rock star dealing with all that stuff. You know, and if you just laid that out, it's like, well, that's Roger Waters. That's, you know, it's not a very thinly veiled metaphor in that sense. As I mentioned, Roger doesn't really do metaphors and allegories all that well. Subtlety is not in his playbook. So I think if they went with Hitchhiking, they went with Pros and Cons, it would have been much more clear from the get-go that this is a Roger Waters like autobiographical piece, and we are here to help him out with that. And there might be less of a headbutting in terms of creative control, because at least then it's like, well, no, we're telling my story here rather than we're telling a story. So yeah, there probably would have been less contention. I still think that the fallout would have been the same. I think they would have butted heads. I think there still would have been that contention. And I think Roger Waters would eventually, like, Rick would still leave. Roger would still kind of soldier on and eventually would dissolve the band. So I think the end result would have been the same. It just probably would have happened a little bit later.
It's always amusing, isn't it, how the band went from being almost democratic to a fault to dictatorial to a fault, because back in the was it Gum around that sort of time when he was basically saying to David Gilmour, right, now you're gonna have to write your own lyrics, we're all gonna take a side of the studio album, including Nick, including Rick. Whatever they do. No one's going to have any impact on it. And he literally rang him up, and he wouldn't give him any help with the words and put the phone down on him, didn't he? So, and then it's funny that there's people that often say, "Oh, Roger was a total tyrant." Well, you couldn't have been back then, because he was actually almost trying to force the creativity out of the rest of them. But fascinating. Yeah. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this. I've thoroughly enjoyed your input and your insights. So as I say, what I'll do is I will put a link to Michael's YouTube channel. I recommend going and having a look at all his works on there. They're entertaining, they're fun, he's got his own complete outlook and their own insights into this wonderful type of music. So please go and check that out. Please like and subscribe, anyone who's enjoyed this too. And thank you again, Michelle, and thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. This was a lot of fun.